Hello and welcome to Chapter 46, which is on animal reproduction. This is Nick Cap for Biology 215, and we're going to have a fun 15 minutes together. Let me get my timer set up and go. This is an animal or a living thing, and it is producing these tiny little orbs there. And those orbs are their reproductive materials. Again, when we look at animals, they can reproduce either sexually or asexually. In sexual reproduction, we see the creation of an offspring by fusion of haploid gametes, where we have male sperm and female eggs that form a zygote. In asexual reproduction, basically, we have creation of offspring without the fusion of egg and sperm. Now, this is critical, and we need to understand this a little bit, and we'll go through it a little bit more. Budding is the simplest form of asexual reproduction, and basically you have a piece of an organism come off, and that can become an individual. Many invertebrates, sea stars and anemones and stuff like that, and sea stars, reproduce asexually by fission, which you separate into two individuals who are roughly about the same size. In fragmentation is where we see the breaking of the body into a number of different pieces, and this can happen in things like sea stars, etc. In the old days, some fishermen wanted to get rid of the sea stars, and what they would do is cut them up in pieces and throw them overboard, and that just made more sea stars. Okay. Again, this process of fragmentation and fission and budding needs to have this regeneration where you can actually make back the body. In parthenogenesis, you see the development of a new individual from an unfertilized egg. And again, many invertebrates and some vertebrates can practice parthenogenesis, and sometimes it's kind of a last-ditch effort. You can't find a mate, so you can go through parthenogenesis. For many sexual reproducing animals, finding a partner can be challenging, and so in this way we have what are called hermaphrodites, where you have an individual has both the male and female characteristics. Typically they don't fertilize themselves, but what you have is when two individuals come together, they mate with each other, and they can both produce offspring, and so they produce both the sperm and the eggs. Several organisms can change their sex under certain conditions. So, again, the male is missing, and or the male gets killed, and one of the females could probably change their sex. Again, most animals exhibit reproductive cycles that are related to changing seasons. Most reproductive cycles are controlled by hormones and environmental cues. Ovulation is the release of mature eggs at the midpoint of the female kind of uterine cycle, and this we tend to see a lot more in males and the males with the uterus. Because seasonal temperature is often an important clue to reproduction, we can see a problem with climate change or climate change that's going to have on that. The next thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is this kind of reproductive handicap that we have. And so maintaining sex differences is actually really expensive. And so an asexual reproduction, or maybe a hermaphroditic reproduction, is where you see an individual, a female, can produce two offspring. Both of those offspring can reproduce. And so in 1, 2, 3 generations, we have lots of offspring. However, in sexual reproduction, with the production of that male, you produce two offspring, and you have one offspring. And so there's a cost to having sex. And so why does it happen? And we'll discuss that during class. In sexual reproduction, again, it's an enigma. Sexual reproduction is really important because it enhances reproductive success of parents when environmental factors are changing rapidly. And so again, you're mixing up these genes and you're producing new combinations. And these genetically varied offspring tend to do a lot better in a varied environment. When the environment is stable, then we will see a preference for the non-sexual reproduction. And again, we've seen that a number of times. Fertilization is the union of egg and sperm. In internal fertilization, the eggs are shed by the female. External fertilization, the eggs are shed by the female and fertilized by sperm in an external environment. A moist habitat is required for this to occur. In this case here, the male frog grips the female, and he was releasing sperm as she is releasing her egg. And so, again, you can see where another male may come over here and try and release his sperm and see if something can happen with that. Again, some species in external fertilization exhibit what we call spawning, where individuals cluster in the same area to release their gametes in the water at the same time. In some cases, these are chemical signals that trigger spawning. In others, it's environmental cues are responsible. So fish would spawn because they can all move together and do that. Again, sea urchins and things like that may spawn, but again, they tend to be together kind of anyways. And again, when they all spawn at the same time, when you release your egg and sperm at the same time, then you could have that. Okay. In internal fertilization, you don't have to worry about somebody else's sperm floating around and fertilizing your egg. In internal fertilization, you can control who goes in there and releases that sperm into that area. So internal fertilization requires behavioral interactions and actually compatible copulatory organs. And so again, many insects have this kind of lock and key with that external skeleton. Only certain size or shaped penises are able to go into the female. Again, mating makes use of pheromones and other chemicals and behavior so that we can control who gets it. Parental care. This is a look at parental care of the kind of eggs for gamete production and delivery. Basically, we have these tissues called the gonads, which are responsible for producing the gametes. And then some organisms do not have gonads, but gametes are formed in undifferentiated tissue. I would tend to not see it as much. More elaborate systems include sets of accessory tubes and glands that carry, nourish, flourish, and protect gametes developing into embryos. And again, we'd see something like that in the fly. And so here is the male fly and the female fly. In the male fly, you have all these ducts. You have the accessory glands, which is going to produce this liquid that contains the sperm and allows the sperm to live, to kind of move into a uterus where it then can kind of move into the ovaries. So it's very critical. And actually, I'll go back here. We have their spermatheca right over here, which actually can store some of the sperm for later for the female to use so that she doesn't have to produce all of her eggs at once. Many of the animals have what's called a cloaca, which is a common opening between the external environment and the digestive, excretory, and reproductive systems. In actually mammals, it is quite different. We tend to see that in non-males. Human male reproductive anatomy, the male's external reproductive organs are the scrotum and the penis. The internal organs are the gonads, which produce sperm and hormones, and accessory glands that secrete and produce needed for sperm movement. Again, know the parts of the male, so be able to follow where sperm is produced in the testes and how it exits through the body, through the prostate gland. And again, here's the bulbourethral gland, the vas deferens, etc., those particular materials. And again, know the females. And again, the ovaries are where the eggs are produced. The eggs are released into the fallopian tubes or the oviduct, move into the uterus, and then eventually outside the body, and be aware of that. Gametogenesis is basically the production of your gametes. Okay, in spermatogenesis, we're producing sperm. Each sperm takes about 7 weeks to develop. You develop, or males develop, about hundreds of millions of sperm per day. This is the structure of what it looks like. Be able to kind of identify what a sperm looks like and the parts of the sperm. A sperm is basically a nuclear delivery vehicle, a nucleus delivery vehicle, and it delivers the chromosomes to the egg. We have these mitochondria on here that produce ATP, but it basically allows the sperm to swim, and so be able to understand that structure. Oogenesis is a little bit different. In the development of a mature egg, it's a very prolonged process. For the most part, females are born with all the eggs that they will develop during their lifetime. At birth, they have these. Again, when the egg, that division occurs relatively early, and we produce what's called an oogonium. That oogonium then divides, finishes up meiosis 1 and the onset of meiosis 2 during the final maturation of the egg, and this produces these things that we call polar bodies that do not go to fruition. Again, spermatogenesis differs from oogenesis in 3 ways. All 4 products of meiosis develop into a sperm, while only one of the 4 becomes an egg. Spermatogenesis occurs throughout the adolescence and adulthood. Sperm are produced continuously without the prolonged interruption of oogenesis that we see. And so, again, we have hormonal control of the testes, and so the testosterone and inhibitin. So, again, if we have plenty of sperm around, we see this feedback loop, which decreases FSH and LH size and reproduces, decreases sperm production. And so at a certain point you stop. Hormonal control of the female reproductive system. This is basically what we call the uterine cycle. Be aware of this. Again, the hormones that I really want you to know are luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, estradiol, and progesterone. And basically what we do is we see a peak in estradiol production. That causes a peak in luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating, which causes release of the egg, or the process that we call ovulation. During ovulation, we would see a rebranding or making of the endometrial lining. And this, if the egg gets fertilized, it will kind of embed into this structure right here. If not, we will see a reduction in progesterone and estrogen levels, both to almost zero, which causes the menstruation to occur. Again, in menopause, basically what's happening is after roughly about 500 cycles, that's basically all the eggs that the female will actually lend to fruition. Menopause is, we see as a cessation of ovulation. We think evolutionary-wise, this allows for the grandparents to actually take better care of the children. So you have somebody there that kind of knows what's going on. The menstrual cycles are characteristics for humans and some other primates, not a lot. In this thing, we see sexual receptivity is basically all the time. In the estrous cycle, which is a little bit different, in this case, the endometrium is reabsorbed by the uterus, and so we don't see the bleeding. Sexual receptivity is limited to a heat period that we call estrus. The length and frequency of the estrous cycles varies from species to species. Okay, and again, things like mice happens a lot quicker, and things like human beings not as much. Well, actually, human beings don't go through the estrous cycle, so I'm sorry about that. An egg develops into an embryo in a series of predictable events, starting from conception, and we see that beginning of zygote. We see the division of cells, forming a blastocyst, or a ball of cells with a central cavity. This is actually occurring in the fallopian tubes, and this cleavage continues until eventually you have a structure that can implant. The embryo, this is kind of unique in here. The blood of the fetus and the mother does not mix together, and what we have is an exchange area over here where that chorion, the fetal position of the fetal portion of the placenta, is exposed to maternal blood, and we see the exchange of those materials. And again, here's some pictures of what the fetus looks like at 5 weeks and at 14 weeks. During that second trimester, the fetus grows and is very active. The mother may feel fetal movements. The hormone levels begin to stabilize. The placenta takes over the production of progesterone, and the hormone, and that's the hormone that kind of maintains the pregnancy rather than the corpus luteum. During the third trimester, the fetus grows and fills the space within the embryonic membranes. Childbirth begins with labor, a series of strong rhythmic uterine contractions that push the fetus and the placenta outside the body. Labor is regulated by prostaglandins and hormones such as estradiol and oxytocin. Oxytocin is very important. Again, here in oxytocin is what we have a positive feedback. And so, again, contractions of the baby moving cause the production of more oxytocin, which causes more contractions. Okay, until basically the baby is gone. What's really kind of interesting, we have something called immune tolerance to the embryo, and a woman's acceptance of these foreign offspring is, again, we don't have an understanding of that. If we did, we could do a lot more. Modern reproductive technologies that make it possible to address some of the infertility that we have. Again, ultrasound imaging is used to detect fetal conditions. We can use something called amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling, where we actually go in and grab a piece of tissue, fetal cells, and we can do genetic analysis on that. Again, mother's blood contains DNA from the embryo. A lot of times we can find that. We're just in the process of starting to look at that. The causes of infertility are varied, and kind of men and women are roughly about equally affected. It's not always the woman. It's not always the man. So again, some of these can be things like STDs that are most significant. So even some of the STDs that are pretty easily curable can cause scarring of the fallopian tubes, or things like the mumps, etc. In vitro fertilization, IVF, mixes egg with sperm in culture dishes and return them to embryo to use at HL stage. Again, sperm and nuclei can also be directly into an oocyte. In this case here, we're actually injecting, here's one sperm right here that's being injected into an oocyte here. And so in modern technology, we have lots of ways to do this. All right, thanks a lot for hearing about reproduction from me. And I will leave it at that.